1868 was, as I said earlier, a pivotal year. It represented sort of the high point, I think, of congressional power in terms of oversight of Reconstruction. And it did so at that moment of impeachment of Andrew Johnson. But I think, again, it's important that Johnson survives. He's handicapped politically, but he survives. And that reminds us that the Republican Party was not simply of one mind. To speak of any party, Republican, Democrat, Whig, whatever it may be, as one kind of organic thing is very problematic. The Republicans, and particularly congressional Republicans, had achieved considerable control over Reconstruction. But in the wake of Johnson's impeachment, and certainly as we move toward the 1870s, congressional control begins to fade. But in some ways, I think the larger argument is that the national attention begins to give way to other concerns. And that's what I want to talk about in this portion of the lecture. Oftentimes, when we think as historians, I guess, about Reconstruction, we think about not only what we believed happened, but we think about how other historians over time have thought about Reconstruction. And for a long while, well into the 20th century, many historians accepted an interpretation of Reconstruction that had the radical Republicans and the Republican Party in the position of the villain, the evil empire sort of Star Wars fame, if you will. It's the myth that pervaded discussions of Reconstruction that inherently the Republicans who were Southern, and we often hear the term used, scalawags, these are Southerners who supported Reconstruction policies of Congress, or carpetbaggers is another term you might have heard, and that refers to Republicans and particularly radicals who came south to serve in politics, to start businesses, and to do other things, that somehow their interests were predominantly self-serving, that they were out to make a quick buck, that they were inherently corrupt, and that the governments that were created from this Republican ascendancy were themselves corrupt and abusive. And I think most historians now would suggest that, as we often end up saying, the story is a lot more complex than that. That the notion that Republicans were inherently corrupt in the South, or even the notion that part of the problem with ineptitude in terms of governance was a result of African Americans themselves gaining political power, any of those mythologies have been called into question, so that we see, again, a far more complex notion of Reconstruction. Indeed, when we think of African Americans and the Reconstruction of the South, it's important to understand just how few African Americans actually moved into political offices during this period. There were members of Congress who were themselves former slaves. And in particular, I just mentioned two, mainly for example, more than anything else, that sort of stand out are Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce, both of them representing Mississippi in the United States Congress during Reconstruction. And that's an odd thing. I mean, think about it. You go from a situation before the Civil War in a place like Mississippi where that's just not going to happen. African Americans are never going to be allowed to serve in high office representing the state of Mississippi. And then during Reconstruction, following the Civil War, you have congressional representatives who are indeed African American. That should tell you sort of how the world perhaps is turning upside down, especially for many Southern whites. And it gives an indication of how this sort of mythology of a black or African American Reconstruction takes hold. But the reality is somewhat different. Both Revels and Blanche K. Bruce represented a small number of people who held high office, and they also performed well in those offices. In fact, it's really the exception in the South that African Americans, even in state governments, should ever gain the ascendancy in terms of numbers, in terms of representation. When it came, for instance, to the constitutional conventions that were held as Southern states began to resume their positions within the Union, really only in one Southern state did African Americans make up the predominance of delegates at the convention, and that was South Carolina. In all the other instances of constitutional efforts, at best, as in Louisiana, it was 50-50. In every other state, whites, many of them with Republican leanings perhaps, but nonetheless whites, are by far the largest numbers who are engaged in this process of reconstituting state government. But all that just goes back to this notion of how we create history. And I use the word create because that's sort of what we do. We interpret, we look back and sometimes look from our own perspectives at how things have unfolded and what things mean. So that it's natural to me that our interpretation of Reconstruction and what it meant and what it was about would have come up for revision, that we would have looked at the evidence and thought more about its meaning. I want to turn now to the question of the Grant administration and what's happening with the radicals in Congress. The election of 1868, which was a presidential election, a presidential year, was important in part not only because it would bring Ulysses Grant, former Union general, to the presidency, but because it in some ways tell us about the importance of race where Reconstruction is concerned. It was important to Unionists. These are people who had supported the Union cause during the Civil War, many of whom had gone on to become Republicans. Some had not, but many had. And to those Republicans who had come south either through the Freedmen's Bureau or for other purposes, perhaps business purposes, it was important to these Republicans to establish their party in the southern United States. That was part of this notion of transformation. Remember in 1860, when Abraham Lincoln had been elected, the Republican Party had been predominantly a regional party, the North, the Middle West, the Midwest, California, but it never entered the South. Whereas after the war and with Reconstruction, we see the emergence of a Southern Republican Party, part of the larger National Republican Party. The question becomes one of race nationally, and to what extent Republicans will be willing to maintain their promises to the freedmen, and the extent to which race will begin to play a role in their decisions about policies that should be followed. Under Ulysses Grant, who proves to be a somewhat troubled president and very much a hands-off sort of president, a number of important pieces of legislation will be passed. And Grant finds himself leaning toward the radicals in his own party, the Republicans, and largely supporting the continuation of congressional efforts to manage Reconstruction. Among the most important pieces of legislation we could look at would be the 15th Amendment, that final of the three that I've mentioned, as well as a particular act, sometimes referred to, or acts referred to as the Enforcement Acts, that included one particular act called the Ku Klux Klan Act, and then a subsequent Civil Rights Act in the 1870s, all intended to shore up the position of African Americans in the South. In particular, when we get to the 15th Amendment, this is known as the Voting Amendment. Right? We've got the abolition of slavery, we've got the Citizenship Amendment, and by 1870 we have ratified an amendment specifically intended to protect the voting rights of African Americans. You can tell in a way that that's tied to the interests of that Republican Party in the South. I mean, after all, former Confederates are probably not going to be interested in supporting the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, even if they can vote. Because remember, many have been disfranchised, have lost access to the ballot box. The 15th Amendment forbade the denial of the right to vote to a citizen based on, and this is a quote, on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And I want to say that one more time. It rejected, the 15th Amendment rejected the denial of the vote to any citizen based on, quote, on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So I've kind of emphasized that, and I did so because that's going to play in a little bit later. In the late 19th century, we're going to talk about something you may have heard about called Jim Crow. And we're going to talk about segregation, and we're going to talk about what happened with African American voting in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And the reason this phrase becomes so important is because it becomes sort of a crux of the matter, especially for the Supreme Court. But again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. The Ku Klux Klan Act, part of that group of so-called enforcement acts, which the Ku Klux Klan Act comes out in 1971 under the Grant administration, it's directly intended to address this growing sort of paramilitary violence in the South. Something that Congress didn't seem to be able to do, something that Johnson had perhaps never intended to do. But the name of the law itself tells you a lot, doesn't it? Most people are familiar at some level with the Ku Klux Klan. And I think background-wise, what you need to know is that the Klan was organized out of Tennessee, specifically in a little town called Pulaski, Tennessee. But by 1867, as Congress begins to take more and more of a role in Reconstruction, we see this small group coming out of sort of rural Tennessee developing into a much larger and much more powerful organization. An organization with a structure that allows for command. And really, that's what's meant by paramilitary. One of the leading figures early on, of course, in the history of the Ku Klux Klan was a very well-known Confederate cavalry leader, officer by the name of Nathan Bedford Forrest. And in many ways, the Klan and organizations like it mimic the sort of military hierarchy that had existed for the Confederate military during the war. But the other thing that this act suggests, and it's why I mentioned the Republican Party, is that the Ku Klux Klan Act, because this violence was directed particularly against African Americans, had a racial element, but it was also political. The Klan itself not only attacked former slaves, but increasingly as congressional Reconstruction or radical Reconstruction emerged, the Klan went after Republicans, people who supported the Reconstruction policies of Congress and sought to implement them. They went after whites from the North, for instance, who had moved south to do business, but who didn't abide by certain conditions of social behavior, like whom they'd have over to dinner, or whom they'd support in an election, or whom they would speak to walking down the street. These were individuals who broke with the expectations, the social mores that these Southerners knew were required to maintain control. And control was not merely control in the fields. It wasn't merely control in the cities, something Howard Rabinowitz has talked a great deal about, or written about, I should say, but it was also control at the ballot box. And that meant resisting Congress and ultimately the Republican Party. A similar piece of legislation I mentioned, of course, was the Civil Rights Act of 1875. But the important thing about the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which sought to maintain an equality of accommodation and public accommodation to ensure that freedmen enjoyed the same rights as white citizens in the South when it came to hotels or eating establishments or things of that nature. Which is, by the way, I'm going to interject here, it's something that would come up again, would it not, in the 1960s with the Civil Rights Movement. You've probably heard about the lunch counter sit-ins, right? Which is all about access to public accommodation and will lead to the passage in the 1960s of another important civil rights bill, 1964. But that's a story for another time, and we'll get to all that. But this Civil Rights Act of 1875 seeks to ensure access to public accommodation. It's not passed easily, however. And what that suggests is that by 1875, the energy and sort of the intensity of the commitment of Republicans and of Congress and of the executive, i.e., of course, Ulysses Grant, to the rights of freedmen was sort of waning, had begun to give way. Like the Republicans in 1868, who would only go so far to stop the executive, Andrew Johnson, they would only go so far to protect the civil rights of African Americans.